The Western world sutures another blow to 21st century security after reeling from the Christchurch shootings last month. As domestic terrorist attacks continue, the media creates a news portfolio that has become magnified under public scrutiny. Certain facts and demographics are privileged over proper representation, leading to a distorted terrorist archetype in the public eye. And so, whether news media reflects public opinion or drives it, the question becomes, does Western media report with fair and balanced analysis, or do they misrepresent terrorism with the disproportionate profiling of certain ethnic groups? Specifically, it will be argued both Sections 1 and 2 of the MEAA Code are in violation within context to reporting terrorism, as the media shows a habitual need to distinguish acts of terror in arbitrary ways. The media's obligations to responsible journalism and the repercussions of failing to do so will also be explored using theoretical frameworks for journalism. Journalists are the scribes tasked with translating the unpredictability of the world into a coherent narrative for society. Therefore, their roles in public discourse cannot be understated. Terrorism is socially contentious and politically charged, and reporting these incidents with objectivity and context are within the public's utmost interest. However, much of the coverage fringes on unchallenged political bias, which typecasts certain demographics. The sharpest divide cuts between white nationalist extremism and Islamic fundamentalism, leading to an overrepresentation of the latter. The dilemma is in the details. The 9/11 attacks created a template for terrorism in Western society. Islam would begin to dominate the debate for decades, while the countercultures of Islam, like white supremacism and white fundamentalism, would simmer quietly under the surface. Coverage of Islamic acts of terror is often spiced with talking points critiquing Islam, immigration, or national security. Conversely, the coverage of white or otherwise Christian terrorists emphasize mental illness, and words like terrorist are often omitted from the headlines. The effect is distinctions between certain acts of terror are made, even when they are materially the same. The Christchurch shootings embody a number of these fallacies. Coverage of Brenton Tarrant was marred in a swamp of contradictions and political grandstanding. The New Zealand Prime Minister rightfully condemned his actions as the heinous acts of terror they were, but many pundits were unwilling to use such terminology. Many chose to dress him in the glamour of mentally ill, or use his actions to inflame the immigration debate. Some even humanized him with stories of his family upbringing. On this, the media failed to correct the record. Discussions of Islam and immigration inflamed the discussion, while many failed to note the irony of an Australian migrant entering a foreign country to enact a terrorist plot. The story itself challenges the casual ideas of terrorism, and yet, the media failed to capitalize on this moment. The Orlando shooting, for example, which saw an alleged ISIS affiliate kill 49 people in a Florida nightclub, was wrapped in similar politics. But, unlike Tarrant, the Orlando shooter became the example and not the exception. That the Orlando shooter represented the everyday fears of Westerners towards Islam. National security experts tell the same tale. The majority of domestic terror attacks are conducted by homegrown right-wing extremists. But the voices of reason have been drowned in a cacophony of paranoid sensationalism. Right-wing violence outnumbers Islamic fundamentalism 2-1, and yet the latter is reported 3 times as often. And so, it is no surprise that the word terrorist conjures the image of a Muslim man, despite the reality. The issue is one of perspective and context. The social contract makes a concord between the public and journalists. The public has a right to information, while journalists, in this argument, have an obligation to the truth which does the most amount of good for the most amount of people. Reporting terrorism is clearly within the bounds of public interest and safety, but journalists have have nurtured a false dichotomy between two forces with varying degrees of influence. As such, the social contract has been broken, as the most amount of good has not been achieved for some of society's most vulnerable. Such reporting has positioned Muslims as the other, or the antagonist to Western values, while white supremacy, arguably the real threat, is cordoned into a separate category altogether. The facts have been stacked in a way that renders fair analysis impossible, a notion antithetical to the principles of sound reporting. Clearly, this is the distorted emphasis Section 1 of the MEAA Code warns against, as some acts of terror receive more coverage than others, thereby misrepresenting the issue. This distorted emphasis also bleeds into the media's second violation, as this distortion has raised the identity of any given terrorist to prominence. These observations are consistent with other race-related issues like police brutality, where African Americans are overrepresented by the American criminal justice system. The public now applies the term of terrorist based on aesthetic criteria, gender, ethnicity, or religion, and have become skeptical of mainstream reporting. And so, the depiction of Islamic fundamentalism reveals another media oversight, the application of an inconsistent definition. The term of terrorist is more debatable than it should otherwise be, as the underlying socio-political mechanisms have been left to the public's imagination. The Iraq War was not terrorism. The Saudi Arabian occupation of Yemen is not terrorism. But the war crimes of Bashir al-Assad are terrorism, according to establishment media. The Christchurch shooting is terrorism to some, the white supremacist Dylan Roof was dubbed a radical youth, and the Pulse nightclub shooter garnered acclaim as America's worst terrorist attack since 9/11. These cases, although different in scale and ideology, all exemplify the accepted definitions of terrorism. Journalists are obligated to report information with unbiased integrity. But how can they do so when they are unable to conform to a uniform definition? The social contract has been smudged, and no one can remember the original print. Now the public is left to fill in the gaps themselves. The media must navigate the decentralized news landscape of the internet, which has allowed the extreme celebrity of terrorists to flourish with greater care. And so, the effects of this haphazard reporting are both profound and unjustified. Journalists have an obligation to not only report news factually, but within their proper contexts. It is incumbent on all news media to correctly proportion information in order to reflect reality, and avoid undue harm by typecasting certain ethnicities or identities unnecessarily. That Islam is drawn as the face of terrorism is a prompt for reflection, especially since that inflated notoriety is exactly what terrorist organizations like ISIS want. Journalists must re-examine their reporting methods. They should become critical of the mechanisms they have come to rely on when reporting terrorism, for they may enable or support this bias. Although journalists are given certain freedoms to report the truth, they cannot exercise this ability in a vacuum, and are just as malleable to social influence as anyone. What makes one thing an act of terror compared to another must be decided in the context of utilitarian principles. In other words, journalists should substitute sensationalism and conformity in favor of public education and benefit. This would mean reporting terrorism regardless of political motivations and superficial details, and applying a stricter definition moving forward. Such a task is difficult, however. If it bleeds, it leads is an adage integral to contemporary journalism, and the concept of a newsworthy story has become ambiguous. News itself has become as much a source of public entertainment as education. The coverage of Christchurch displayed some hallmark sensationalist motifs, as many outlets chose to reveal clips of the shooter's live stream. The public's right to see that footage is tangential to this discussion, but it exemplifies the issues journalists have when reporting terror, as they walk the tightropes of extreme celebrity and the public good. They can, however, easily improve their current reporting. It is time to correct the record and apply the same standards of terror to all stories. In the interest of journalistic integrity, the media must de-emphasize identity unless it is relevant to the story, as it is often the case with terrorism. Doing so may even pacify some of the swelling tides of Islamophobia within the Western world. Thank you.